Hello. I know this is usually isn't a time slot for our Wednesday show, and this will not be a red zone episode, although I may chide our guest on my Broncos giving a heartbreaking defeat to his world champion Eagles. As I said yesterday, the scheduling of these great minds is causing a bit of turmoil in our scheduling. But at TIR, we listen to you. Well, sometimes we listen. But you watched the interactivity. You want the interactivity, and we do what we can to bring it to you live. And we will be back tomorrow, also at a different time, to speak with union organizer Eric Blank about the folly of ultra-leftism and the failure of the unions and the Dems to hold strong on the longest government shutdown in history. Checked the YouTube listing to see what time the show goes live near you. I do want to thank all of you for taking the time to check this out. If you haven't done so already, please hit like and subscribe. It is a very passive gesture that goes a long way in promoting the channel. Also, TIR is a listener supported, and if you enjoy shows like this and would like to make sure TIR can stay on the air, well, there's a couple of ways. You can be a paid YouTube subscriber or patron by becoming a subscriber or a patron. You can join us for our movie nights like we had last night, where we watched the 1986 classic film that takes place in Dustin's home state of Pennsylvania at close range. And you get access to the champagne rooms as well. Also, if you're listening to the show later on Apple Podcasts, if you want to access the champagne room, just become a paid subscriber and you'll have access to champagne rooms past and present as well. Now, on to the show, what you guys came here for, to discuss between moral panic and political suicide. When Donald Trump first ran for president, his campaign was steeped in xenophobia built on images of migrant caravans filled with drug dealers and murderers. The rhetoric was cruel but effective. It mobilized fear, reshaped the GOP's populist base, and framed immigration as an existential threat to real America. In office, his policies, family separations, child detentions, ICE militarization, became both a moral outrage and political ammunition for Democrats to brand themselves as the resistance to creeping neo-fascism. But 8 years later, the politics of immigration have taken a strange turn. Even after his first term, Trump expanded his support among Latino voters, not in spite of his immigration rhetoric, but because of his tough talk about deporting bad people. When he returned to office in 2025, that rhetoric became reality. The ICE raids in blue cities, Gestapo-like in execution, have proven politically volatile. They were meant to show control, but instead they've created deep fractures within his own base. Many Latino voters who once backed him are now recoiling at the televised brutality of the raids. Still, the larger question remains: what does this moment reveal about the failure of both parties to connect with the working class on the issue of immigration? When Democrats and sections of the left respond with moral outrage alone, they often overlook how immigration is experienced materially by working people facing stagnant wages, housing insecurity, and crumbling public resources. As our guest Dustin GUASTELLA writes in his latest piece for Damage Magazine, called Between Moral and Political Suicide, quote, as the center-left embraced globalism, they also traded their blue-collar social bases for the Brahman voters who dominate these parties today. The class composition of the current parties of the left has blinded them to the nature of the problem and the ways in which slogans of global openness are received by blue-collar workers. By virtue of their white-collar work life, most progressives are not adversely affected by immigration. In fact, in many ways, thanks to cheaper services and more diverse consumer choices, they actually benefit. As a result, they have internalized the notion that globalized labor markets benefit all. They are permanently shocked to find that the masses reject that claim, unquote, unquote. While we can all agree that ICE raids and the terrorizing of immigrant communities are moral abominations, we have to move beyond moralizing globalization under the banner of internationalism. What would a working class politics of migration look like? One rooted in solidarity, not slogans. Please welcome returning guest Dustin Costella, Director of Operations for Teamsters Local 623 in Philadelphia and board member of the Center for Working Class Politics.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It's always a pleasure to have you on. It's always hard to get you on because you're a serious person that isn't busy doing the podcast rounds. So when you're busy actually doing the organizing work, you don't have time to shoot the shit with someone like me. And I'm okay with that. In your piece between moral and political suicide, which if you are listening or watching this show, there's a link in the description to the piece in Damage Magazine, you draw a distinction between moral and material politics. Can you explain what you mean by that distinction in the context of immigration, please?
Yeah, so the impetus for this piece was obviously the second Trump election. But more than that, Perry Anderson, the left-wing historian, British left-wing historian, wrote an interesting sort of panorama of what's going on in the left and what's going on with the populist right. And what he gets at in that is that basically the singular issue that unites all the populists on the right is immigration. In country after country after country, immigration is the thing that all of these right-wing populists are kind of riding the crest into power on the back of, right? And they're all asking for the same thing: restricted immigration, kick the immigrants out. And you have to wonder, if this is the case, you can't just chalk this up to, well, all of the people in the world have just been, brainwashed by the exact same hate virus, right? Xenophobic hate virus. You have to say, okay, even if this is driven by xenophobia, even if this is driven by, anxieties about difference or anxieties about diversity or anxieties about change, there's something that has to be driving this. And this is what it means to move from the register of sort of moralism, which is to say we stand morally for the openness of a society, into the register of democratic or material politics, where we actually think, okay, what is it that's going on here that's driving the same exact phenomena in France, in Italy, in Germany, in the United States, in Mexico, in Denmark? How is it that all of these forces are having a similar effect all over the world? And so what I wanted to see was, okay, what is really going on with immigration? And when you peel back the layers, you start to learn that, well, this is an issue that many parties on the center left have basically, given up on trying to figure out, and instead shopped out the policy playbook to, and Bernie said this, almost 10 years ago now, shopped out the policy playbook to people like the Koch brothers, who really liked the idea of cheap, pliant labor in the rich countries and thought it would be fine to just allow the immigration system to kind of tacitly open up and let in tons of immigrants in order to keep wages low. And that was their plan all along. And it turns out it worked. And it frustrates a lot of people across most of the developed world and the developing world.
You write, excuse me, that the center left traded their blue collar social bases for Brahman voters. First of all, you might want to explain to people what a Brahman voter is and how did that shift happen, and what has it done to the left's ability to speak to working class concerns?
Yeah, so Brahman voters is a phrase that Thomas Piketty, the French economist, came up with when he was looking at the composition of right-wing and left-wing parties all over the West, basically. And what a Brahman voter is somebody who is educated, highly educated, usually a white-collar worker, usually works in the knowledge sector in one of the big coastal cities, right? These voters have come to be the new base of left-wing parties. They are the major force of left-wing parties, right? We hear all the time how the left is, the Democrats have lost the working class, or in Europe, it's the Social Democrats have lost the working class. And part of what is happening there is that these center-left parties have basically built their political strategy around winning white-collar, highly educated voters, usually voters with fairly high incomes as well, to supplement the fact that they've lost a big chunk of their working class base. So that's the Brahman phenomena. And this is a phenomenon that's happened all over the world. The United States is not unique. There is maybe one or two countries in the world where it's not happening. And we'll get into that because it's quite closely related to the immigration issue. Mm-hmm. Now, how they did this and what effect it's had is pretty simple. I think what happened starting in the 1980s is many left-wing parties had given up on the bigger dream of true social transformation, a democratic political economy, and they signed on to the idea that, look, history is going to be ending. Socialism, capitalism, these are old-fashioned fights. What's new now is everybody's going to prosper. We're going to have a global society. Technology is going to make everything cheap, abundant, and easy to access. And so this old framework of, the working class and the professional class and these different classes that are sort of vying for their interests, that doesn't really work anymore. Of course, the reason they came to think this was because suddenly these parties were extremely reliant on corporate donations that became a major reason for them to reevaluate sticking with their working class constituents who had demands that were diametrically opposed to their donor class funders. So they created, Clinton and, Blair over in the UK and a dozen other parties. This happens in France, it happens in Germany, it happens in Italy. They all come up with this idea that, look, what we can do is win the upscale, educated liberal voters because they don't like the religious kind of reactionary right. They're not interested in the traditionalism or the cultural conservatism, but they're also not really, they don't have working class interests, so we have to appeal to them some way. And all of the parties started transforming themselves in this way. In France, at one point, the Socialist Party went so far to distance itself from its root that one of the presidential candidates I think it was in the late 90s or early 2000s, refused to use the word worker at all in any of his speeches. So this was a conscious strategy. It wasn't something that just accidentally happened one night and they woke up and said, oh my God, where did all the workers go? But as that happened, what the result of this was, famously in the United States, Chuck Schumer says, for every blue collar worker we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we'll pick up 2 suburban Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia, right? That was the plan. But what ends up happening is not only do you lose the blue collar workers in Western Pennsylvania, but by virtue of sort of holding yourself into this professional class milieu, you also lose a broader layer of voters in general. So now these parties can't even really cobble together a real majority. And that's why we see over and over again, parties like the Democrats are in perpetual crisis. They don't know how to appeal to voters. They're constantly talking to each other about what is it that voters want. They don't know because they haven't been talking to ordinary people for so long that they've lost connection with that. And this is true too, not just of the center left and the elites in the parties, but also of the activist left, of the far left and the progressive left, many of whom come out of university educated backgrounds, have white collar jobs. And so even on the sort of progressive edge, issues especially like immigration, are just not understood at the class level the way that they are among blue collar workers. And so you constantly see this strange dynamic develop where even people who are on the left who say, no, I support workers' rights, I support, expanding the welfare state, I support pro-union legislation, I support a job guarantee, I support Medicare for all, I support all these things. Then when it hits the immigration question, suddenly it's like, well, of course I'm not a bigot. I think we should have openness. I think we should have, I'm not for open borders maybe, but I'm for broadly liberal asylum and immigration laws. I think it's basically good for the economy to have more immigration in. I think it's basically good for the economy to embrace as many immigrants as we can. And then you talk to working class people and the attitude is very, very different.
Very different.
And that's where I think the sort of class chasm has developed.
Is this where the Bernie Sanders comment comes into play that a lot of people were upset about recently? And by a lot of people, I mean the internet. I don't, I live in Mexico, so I haven't talked to many Americans about how they feel about borders. But Bernie Sanders made a statement about the Biden administration being really bad on borders. But during Biden's time in office, there was a flood of people to the border in a way that we didn't really see during Trump. But that being said, that comment about borders, I think to your point, plays to people's over moralizing of the immigration issue, where you can't even get people to talk about H-1B visas in shows like this. It's just simply, like you said, I'm not a bigot. So what do you think people missed in what Bernie Sanders was saying about borders?
Yeah, so Bernie's been saying this forever. I mean, one of the big things, and it's very funny now because it shows to a certain extent the way in which Bernie has been so far ahead of the Democratic Party on all of these issues, and that even some of his activist supporters have not quite caught up to him. Back in 2016, Bernie gave an interview with Ezra Klein, where Ezra was basically foisting the question of open borders on him. And he said to him over and over again, well, if you're a socialist, you must be for open borders because it will improve those immigrants' lives, because if they come to the United States, they'll be a lot richer than if they stay in their home country. And Bernie responded, yes, but everybody in America would be a lot poorer. Ezra was shocked by this. He was shocked that somebody on the left would say something like that. And Bernie explained to him patiently, the way labor markets work, and the way if you sort of let a bunch of people into a labor market, the wage is going to drop to the base minimum wage, and you're going to have a lot of frustration and friction in the labor market. And it's going to be very bad for the workers who are already there. Bernie basically said the same comment. I think, what was it, 2 weeks ago? He made the same exact comment and I was shocked. He got the same exact look of shock and surprise from some quarters of the left, that people think that there is simply no trade-off between a fully liberalized border and the labor market in which working class people work. And it's still something that I think people are having a hard time metabolizing. One can hold, and most workers in this country actually do hold two positions in their head, that basically gulagging families off the street and sending them, back, not even back home, back to random places wherever wherever the administration deems fit, is a moral abomination and horrible. And also that we need democratic control over the border and the labor markets. You can have both of those positions. Mm-hmm. It's most workers actually do believe both of those things, that we should have some restrictions on immigration, or stronger restrictions that we currently have, and that the current Trump policies are an abomination. So why people are shocked by Bernie basically embracing the position that I think is a majority position among blue collar workers, blows my mind, because it's the reason that Bernie is who he is. It's his ability to actually understand working class people that makes him the popular figure that he is. Whereas many people on the left still do not understand that that is the key to being a popular figure on the left, is actually understanding what ordinary working class people want, not understanding what you, the leftist, wants.
Do you think that's a problem with this iteration of the left being a left that was kind of born out of the rise of media figures more so than true working class organizing? So I bring that up because I would say the downside, a major downside in that, is that you don't have PBS-like funding. You don't have NPR-like funding. And what I mean by that is you don't have the ability to do shows that aren't going to gain a big audience, that might not be something that people are interested in, and call it the left, right? Masterpiece Theater. I don't know what their Nielsen's ratings were like when they were on PBS. So you kind of have to chase the hot topic. And if someone like Bernie Sanders has a quote unquote hot take, and I don't think that was the hottest take, I agree with you, it's something you have to chase from a different perspective. And it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around it, because you can't even have the conversation that we're having. Like literally, as we're speaking right now, YouTube has nuked this stream. So it's hard to even have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the media. I think the other part of it is there's almost a partisanship that is developed even among people who don't say they support the Democratic Party, or that they're far beyond the Democratic Party. There's a kind of left-right partisanship that is developed, where if you are on the left, you're expected to hold a certain set of positions, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if your version of being on the left is I vote for Pete Buttigieg, or I am a communist in a small tiny sect. There's a set of kind of positions that have blossomed on the internet that have become synonymous with the left, right? These positions often aren't connected to class interests, like working class interests, but rather sort of floating between, something like class values of what I think is the progressive activist middle class. These are the values that they want to see in the world. And they're admirable, right? Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking that it would be a wonderful world in which people could freely move between equal nations, where there was, tremendous amount of, jobs available in abundance. But that's not the world we live in. And to understand the world that we live in, you have to actually break out of those internet bubbles and talk to people who work for a living, And when I was writing this, I talked to a lot of Trump voters, especially blue collar Trump voters. And I remember one guy in particular who said to me, I'm not opposed to immigrants. He said they bust their hump. They work harder than many Americans that I work with. But that's just the problem. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, they're a permanent underclass of people who work much harder than American workers do because they have to. This was a clear class understanding that this guy had, right? And his frustration wasn't the immigrant. It was a structure that basically says there's always going to be this group of really hardworking people that are just beneath you. Not only are they keeping your wage down, but they themselves are always going to be below you on the wage scale. And that, I think, if you work in construction, this was an asphalt worker, if you work in construction, if you work in manufacturing or logistics or warehousing, and you see that, it becomes shocking to you. And you think to yourself, look, there's something really broken in a society that allows basically a permanent underclass to exist. And anybody who says anything about it is considered crazy or a bigot or something like that. And that's, I think, one of the big reasons why the right has been able to sweep up among these kind of workers.
Trump's call to deport bad people resonated with many working class Latino voters. What does that tell us about how class identity and cultural belonging are being redefined in this political moment?
Yeah, so again, you mentioned this before, but the immigrant surge at the border under Biden had a lot of really negative effects on the small towns that sort of dot the Texas and California border. Not only were these towns directly the people who had to integrate and sort of facilitate a lot of the immigrants that were coming in, but because of the nature of the flows of drugs and stuff, these towns got hit the hardest, right? These little tiny border towns, which were overwhelmingly working class, and until 2024, overwhelmingly Democrat voting, all of a sudden got hit with a flood of both drugs and immigrants. Naturally, Trump managed to force those two things together and say, they're one and the same, they're all the same problem, and you're suffering it. Latinos are not any sort of different than any other group, right? They're the same as any other group of working class people. They reacted the exact same way that other working class people would react if their small town suddenly got hit with the kinds of things that happened, right? And I think it's really worrisome that people on the left are not willing to even admit that the reason those appeals worked wasn't because all of these Latino working class voters suddenly became really xenophobic or started hating Mexicans. I mean, many of them, almost all of them on the Texas border are Mexican, right? It's because the social world in which they lived suddenly became very difficult. It became fraught, it became imbalanced, and it became structurally challenging for them to navigate. And many people on the left, I'm sorry to say, just denied that it was even happening. It was not a problem. It didn't exist. There was no drug problem. There was no crime problem. There is no immigrant surge. This was what they were being told by leaders in the Democratic Party for a long time. Trump comes along and he says, look, see, I told you. I told you. And I think people took they just like in 2016, they took another gamble on the guy. And unfortunately, he's, making his most of it.
Was this also kind of a brilliant strategy in the Biden administration? I know Trump tried to do migrant caravans, but I believe it was Stephen Miller that told me he couldn't do it from a federal level. But the states being able to kind of burden cities that are already burdened with large populations by just 30,000 migrants, I think you get in a place like Chicago. And you had for the first time this almost war of resources where at one point a few years ago, when that started, you had the president of the NAACP in Illinois saying, basically get these people out of here now. There was a lot of angry black people at what they felt was going on, and the right was able to kind of brilliantly use that rhetoric. And all I could hear on the left was, "There's nothing to see here. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Crime is down. Everyone's just minding their own business." And there's almost this kind of delusion where you're like, you weren't the people that ride the subway. You weren't the people that work in certain environments, live in certain apartment complexes. Not to say that everyone's a criminal. Definitely not saying that. But it's kind of foolish to think that you're going to put 30,000 people in a city, and each one is just kind of cowering in fear in the corner and just wants to be a nice person. There's going to be some criminal elements in there. They're going to mix with criminal elements that already exist within the city.
Right. Well, and not only that, you're putting them into cities that are already facing housing crises, cities that are already facing drug crises, cities that are already having affordability problems, right? It's not like, people keep thinking, they try to compare the contemporary economy to, say the 1890s and the 1900s when we took in tons and tons of immigrants. The big difference then was we were building railroads across the country. There was tons of economic juice sort of pumping through the American economy that could absorb a ton of labor, right? Guess what? Where's all the economic juice in the contemporary American economy? It's in tech, it's in finance, it's in, hold up at the top of the society. It's not creating millions and millions of jobs for ordinary people. People who come here with nothing to work with but their muscles are going to have a really hard time because there's just not a lot of high wage jobs for them to do. And they will immediately be in competition with some of the hardest scrabble workers who have been here for a while, who are doing those few jobs that are high wage. And so there's automatically going to be a conflict here. And then you add to that the general social erosion in American cities, which has to do with drugs, has to do with crime, has to do with all these other crises. And you just have a really terrible concoction. So I think you're right. I think the right was very smart they ratcheted up the misery index, both on the immigrants and on these cities that had a much harder time coping. But the other thing they did, and this is, I think, one of the most dastardly things Trump did, was when Biden finally came to and said, okay, we got to get this immigration thing solved. And they had this bipartisan group of senators come together to craft an immigration bill that, greatly would have greatly changed the nature of immigration in the United States. Trump refused to let Republicans sign it and was very clear that he did not want the immigration issue solved. He did not, and he still is this way. I think one thing many people who see the sensationalism of the deportations miss about Trump is at the same time that he's deporting tons of people and making a big show of deporting people, he recently changed the farm rules for guest workers so dramatically that the United Farm Workers Union went ballistic seeing what he did. Because effectively what he did was say, in fact, guest workers can basically be here for as long as they want and as many of them as we want to come. Oh, and the standard minimum wage that we used to apply to them no longer applies. So they can freely drive down the wages in agriculture to as low as any subsistence wage they can meet. And he did this at the same time that he was doing the deportations. So it's really important to recognize that when people say we want democratic control of the labor market, it is not what Trump is doing. What Trump is doing is a sensational, very, crazy kind of policy of deportations for political effect. What he's not doing is actually tightening the labor market.
Is it working politically?
Trump's thing? I don't think so. I think it's starting to backfire. I mean, we'll see in the midterms. That's really the only test. But I don't think, the research that we've done with the Center for Working Class Politics finds very consistently that most working class people, including working class Trump voters, do not think that law-abiding residents who have been here paying taxes and working should just be summarily deported. They don't think that. What they think is that we need a tighter labor market and we need to restrict the immigration that's coming to this country, and we need to take care of criminals, basically. Anybody who's here illegally and also selling drugs should be gone, right? That's the modal opinion of working class people in the United States. What Trump is doing is going far, far beyond that. And I think people are scandalized by it. When you talk to people, they see it as not what they bargained for. Now, he's MAGA base, the hardcore MAGA base, they like this. This is sort of red meat for them. But I think most people who sort of voted for Trump for economic reasons or voted for Trump because they were frustrated with Biden, those people do not like the deportation strategy, even if they agree with Trump broadly on the immigration question.
How can the left address the material anxieties surrounding immigration, housing, jobs, wages, without collapsing into xenophobia or right-wing populism?
Yeah, so I think it all comes down to a critique of globalization, a meaningful critique of globalization. And I think what the left has sort of lost in, its recent iteration is understanding that the global economy, the global labor market, and the global finance market are fundamentally arrayed against democratic nation states, and that the sovereignty of workers is all nation-based, right? Workers don't have a vote at the UN, but they do have a vote in their nation's elections, right? Mm-hmm. So understanding that means understanding that the nation state itself is actually the place in which democratic decisions need to be made. Well, you can't do that with global corporations, global finance, and a global labor market. Suddenly, the nation state loses its power to actually affect change when these forces, which are so much larger than the nation state and can flit from nation to nation to nation, moving their capital, moving their people, and moving their power wherever they see fit, it won't work. And so a reasonable response, and this is the kind of response that we've seen, especially in Mexico, under AMLO, but then continuing under Sheinbaum, is to say, look, this is all of a piece. Globalization, the globalization of finance, and the flexibilization of labor happened at the same time for the same reasons. So if we want to claw back one, we have to claw back the other. And that's the only way that you can make the case that the reason that we are trying to impose some democratic control over the labor market and to narrow down the labor market from the global level to the national level, the reason we're doing this is not out of cruelty toward immigrants, and not because we think immigrants are all criminals or because we think immigrants are changing the character of the nation in dastardly ways or something like this. But the reason we're doing this is because if we don't, we will lose the sovereignty that we have. We will lose the ability for workers in their own nations to direct what their country looks like. And that's the key that I think many people on the left need to absorb, that we have to stop thinking that we can leapfrog from the nation state to internationalism through globalism. The exact opposite has happened. Globalism has made it much harder to have internationalism, because the internationalism that exists is an internationalism of finance. It's not an internationalism of workers. What workers are doing all over the world is consistently saying, we want you elites here in my home, in my nation, to start paying attention to us domestic workers here in my home, in my nation. And they're saying that in both left-wing and right-wing ways all over the world.
Yes. And what's been the response? The response seems like, shut up.
Yeah. The response from the center-left parties has been, you must be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Or you're just racist. Is that the response? You're just racist.
You're just racist, or you don't get it. I mean, the response today, you see it all the time from center-left pundits when it comes to trade, right? Trump's trade strategy is completely out of whack. He uses tariffs in a crazy way that nobody has ever used them before. But as a result, many liberals have said, well, obviously, this shows the complete foolhardiness of trying to claw back manufacturing jobs, right? It's so stupid. Why would anybody think that you could do this? And a lot of liberals, center-left liberals, have said, don't these people see how rich trade has made them? No, they don't. Because if you lived in a town where a factory disappeared, trade did not make you rich. And just because GDP went up for the nation doesn't mean you get a dividend check from the federal government. It's not as if every time a factory closes and GDP goes up, somebody sends you a check from the government saying, hey, hooray, here's your GDP increase paycheck. No, instead you lose your job, you watch your town crumble from a fairly stable community into one that's typically filled with drugs as a result of people not having work and not having opportunities, and then slowly seeing even the meager, smaller level opportunities disappear. So no, you can't say to these people trade has been good for them. It hasn't. It fundamentally hasn't. It's been very good for certain college educated people who live in big cities and who make high incomes, but it has not been good for the average American worker, nor has it been good for the average Mexican worker, nor has it been good for the average French worker. I've yet to find a country in which total global openness has worked out in the favor of the working class.
Is it this idea too that the quote unquote working class has a color? Like that was a lot of the first Trump election was the basket of deplorables, the white working class, right? When we think of the Rust Belt, I think a lot of people think of these kind of poor, dilapidated white cities, Warren, Ohio, for example, where pretty much all the factories are shut down now.
Famously white Detroit.
Yeah, white Detroit. Ignore Motown. Nothing to see here. These aren't the Negroes you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think liberals created a narrative that said there's an undeserving poor, and the undeserving poor are the white ones, and their gripes and their frustrations are, they're just racist or they're just crotchety or whatever. And the problem with that, this election, and I think this is one reason why they all started freaking out, is because it stopped being just white workers, right? Suddenly, huge chunks of black workers, huge chunks of Latino workers defected from the Democratic coalition. And that, I think, finally sent a shockwave of realization through. Now, of course, they're not going to do anything about it, but they were surprised by it. They didn't expect this to happen. They believed their own propaganda that it wasn't class, that it was race doing all of this. And we knew, people's work lives matter far more than the color of their skin in terms of their political positions. So, yeah, of course, nowadays, the same working class people who have the same jobs but happen to have different skin color and different names and maybe speak different languages, of course, they have the same class interests and see the same things that working class whites did. And I think a better way for people to understand this, if they want to understand why it happened in such a segmented way, is that working class whites often having better wage to start with, often having a higher wage to start with, saw the fastest collapse of their living standards, right? And they are the ones, so they were like the canaries in the coal mine. They were the first ones to start sounding the alarm and saying something is wrong, something is bad, something's going south here. And the right responded to that with racialized dog whistles and making it all about crime or race or these other issues without really addressing the root problems. But the frustrations that those white workers had are the same as the frustrations that Latino workers now have and that black workers have, right? Those frustrations haven't changed because nobody's actually changed the nature of political economy in America. And so it's just a broader and broader swath of America are being pushed into that big ball of frustration at the bottom of the income ladder.
Does AI increase this anxiety, this idea that we're going to get all these jobs automated, or that's not really a working class concern today?
I think it is, and I think it's not going to. I don't think AI is the thing that a lot of people talk about, but robotics definitely is. And if you are a manufacturing worker or a logistics worker, you are seeing roboticized, automated factories, and those things are terrifying because, years and years ago, when robotics would come in, the unions would be able to say, "Look, you're getting twice as much productivity out of us because you have this new robot. So we want big wage increases." Well, what happens when you have an almost totally deunionized workforce? They can't wring any concessions out of these things, right? You have robots that have lights out factories and can go, 24 hours a day building stuff. There's no workers involved. So there is a real anxiety about the nature of automation and robotics. The trouble is that, very few people have any idea. I mean, there's a fatalism about this stuff. It's already here. It's coming. There's nothing you could do. We individually sort of have to steel ourselves for it. The few workers that are in unions are thinking thoughtfully about how we can sort of, protect ourselves against automation. But the vast majority of workers who aren't in unions are just thinking of ways that they can survive, figuring out ways to like claw together different gigs and jobs that they can figure out how to hopefully make an income when whatever job they have is suddenly automated.
That's frightening. Earlier today, I watched an interview with, I can't remember the movie studio, but there's the first ever AI actress, and they're about to create 80 more characters for her to be in movies with that'll have distinct ethnicities and voices and personalities. And the rationale behind it was, you have an actor that can work 24/7. They don't need time off. They don't need a break. They don't have drug problems. This is perfect.
Yeah. No, it's dark. And I think, we're so removed from the era of Henry Ford that these billionaire class and the oligarch class, the tech titans and all of them, it's kind of surprising to me that it doesn't occur to them that they need somebody to buy the crap that they're making. Like they're effectively automating away their customers by doing a lot of this. You can't just have a society where 1/3 of people are out of work. I mean, it was a disaster when we had the Depression. Yet they think that should be the normal mode of society until we can maybe get half of people out of work. And then with more advances, maybe everybody will be out of work. I have no idea what this short-termism of the way in which they think, it just blows my mind, especially in comparison to the mid-century, when American capitalists, for their own selfishness, thought to themselves, you know what, if I want to sell more cars, I should make it so that workers can buy them. That's not at all the way that the capitalist class in America thinks today.
Is it because 2008 was so short-lived for them?
I think partly, yeah. I think, there was no consequences, right, Jason? Mm-hmm. It was like, big bailouts, and what happened? Did any of them go to jail? Nobody went to jail.
Nobody went. I mean, there were people that committed suicide, but how low on the totem pole were they of importance as far as, pulling the strings of changing legislation that deregulated certain industries?
Sure.
I think there was the fear of prison that scared them more than anything. And I'm thinking of some of the Enron guys that killed themselves. But no, I can't remember. There were some big show trials, but as far as consequences that we saw, legislation that would change to protect consumers, just regular citizens, is gone. And this administration now is getting rid of the Consumer Finance Protection Board. Am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. So being able to run roughshod is just kind of what they do. But to your point, I don't understand why you'd want to do that to the detriment of what I would assume is your bottom line. Does everyone just think they're going to go to Mars?
It blows my mind. I mean, maybe they all think they can terraform Mars and the robots can work for them. But even then, I mean, I've read one, there is definitely a escapism among some of these people, the super, super elite.
Yes.
They're building complexes in the middle of the desert, and they're sort of developing these big kind of safety mechanisms at these boarded up complexes. But I remember reading about one of these things, of this guy who's spending, $1 million to build some safe house in the middle of the desert for when, I guess when the barbarian hordes descend, because he's automated away all their jobs. And I thought to myself, he says in this interview that it's gonna the place will have to be staffed by like 25 people. I thought to myself, what do you think they're gonna do?
What? How do you protect yourself? Douglas Rushkoff has a real interesting thing that he wrote from a speech he gave years ago. I don't know if you follow his work at all when it comes to speaking the language of elites, where they asked him, well, what do we do when money has no value? Where can we protect ourselves from the help? was literally the question they
Yeah.
asked him. Because we don't know how to do these things alone. We need help. So what do we do when you can't pay the help? And I thought that was interesting that people are already planning for this kind of dystopia that they would be the cause of.
Right. It's really bizarre. But yeah, I mean, there's just no. I think part of the weird high tech, high finance thing too, is that they don't really have because a lot of the stuff that they make is not tangible. It exists sort of in the ether.
Mm-hmm.
They don't, I feel like, have really much of a stake at all in not just in the nation, but in the sort of real world, right? Like they don't have much of a stake in the built environment or anything like this. That's all kind of not important to them. And this sort of gets back to where I think the left needs to start sort of remembering its roots, understanding that place and like the place that you actually live is important, and that keeping those things sort of the main part of the politics is important, is a huge way in which people understand the politics of class. It's not easy to say, well, I'm for the working class, but I also think that everything is the same and we can sort of have a global economy and everybody can just move here to there and it should be all fine. It's like people actually want to like the place that they're from, and they want to be proud of the place that they're from. And that means investing in places, not just investing in numbers or technologies or things like this. So another aspect of clawing back the economy from the hyper globalized market is to say we want to invest in specific places. We want to invest in revitalizing parts of the country that have been hit hardest by globalization. And that's how you can actually develop a real strategy that can slowly claw back a lot of voters from the right. And I think that's something that the left needs to be thinking about, is how do we actually develop economic policies to fix the economic problems in the places where it's been hit hardest. That's something that many people on the left need to start thinking very seriously about. How do we fix places like Detroit? How do we fix places like Flint, Michigan, after the factories have closed, after everything has left? We can't just say, if we leave it to the market, it'll work itself out. We've been doing that for 50 years, and it's been a disaster. So we need to think of how to revitalize these places, and doing so in a way that says we want place-based manufacturing. We want place-based development. We don't want this stuff flying all over the globe the minute that wages tick up, the minute that people start making a little bit more than some factory worker far away. We don't want them to say, we're going to pick up and ship to that other place. We have to figure out how to make the policies to make that possible.
What might a class-based approach to immigration look like? One that maintains solidarity across borders, but also protects domestic labor standards?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not surprisingly, it's what the old social democratic parties used to do, and it's what Scheinbaum is trying to do right now. It basically has two components. One, it's the ideological and rhetorical component, which is there's no need to demonize immigrant workers. There's no need to employ xenophobia. All of those things are morally abhorrent and shouldn't be used. There are completely good and valid reasons to support immigration restriction that have nothing to do with talking about how immigrants are bad or evil or anything like that. Case in point, Philip Randolph, back in the teens, wrote an article about how he wanted, and this is a little too extreme and wouldn't work economically, but just to show you where the labor movement used to be on this question. Now, Randolph was the organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, one of my idols, and one of the most important socialist trade union leaders in the history of this country. And he wrote an article in the 19-teens saying, we don't want any immigrants coming in right now. We don't want any. We want zero. And he went on to explain all the reasons why there's a problem with too much immigration and all this kind of stuff. The same kinds of things that you would hear today, except you would hear them from the right. Mm-hmm. Now, what Randolph didn't say was anything about how the race is a problem, that their race is a problem, anything about how that they're dirty or somehow unclean, anything about how they as individuals are a problem or backward or culturally malfunctioned. He merely talked about the fact that the labor market can't absorb these new entrants into it, right? That's how the left can talk about immigration. On the policy side, I think things are trickier. People need to think about how it's going to work. You need to balance restriction with what the labor market actually does need. And those things are things that we need to sort of work out with economists and figuring out what actually a sensible restricted immigration policy looks like, rather than what Trump is doing, which is just a sort of across the board madness. Mm-hmm. Doing those two things at once gets you closer to what I think would be a reasonable and sane immigration position, and one that can win, one that can actually bring the left back to power. But the most important thing is actually understanding what drives this politics. If you don't understand that, the rest of this doesn't make any sense. If you do understand that, the policy choices can be figured out later.
His name is Dustin GUASTELLA. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's links in the description to his piece in Damage Magazine, Between Moral, what was it called again?
Between Moral and Political Suicide.
Thank you. And apparently saying the word suicide gets your stream pulled down from YouTube, regardless of the context.
Wow, really? Is that?
Yeah, I totally forgot about that. Totally forgot. Yeah. I could have called this anything else. I could have called this, assaulting a kitten, and it would have been fine. But because we said moral and political suicide, which would definitely mean not the real one.
Right.
The censors are like, no.
These are our genius algorithm lords. They're gonna get, these are the things that are going to be able to, unleash, what do they call it? Advanced, what is it? Super intelligence or something?
Oh, that's what it's called. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Dustin, look, good luck to you, your Phillies, your Flyers, and your Eagles, and your 76ers.
Yeah, that's right. You got all of them there. And the Unions, actually. The Philadelphia Union, our soccer team, are in the playoffs as well.
Does that really count?
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I hope I'll see you again soon.
Me too. Peace out, Dustin. Thank you very much. It's Dustin GUASTELLA. Again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show, links in the description. Before I even write the description for the show, bam! It's a link to Dustin's article in a magazine that I have been published in, Damaged Magazine. Please check out. The latest edition is actually really interesting. Dustin's piece just grabbed me. I hope you guys check it out. And on that note, we are out.